History has taught us to fear the enemy at the gate, the invader, the outsider with a blade. What if I told you that the most devastating betrayals in human history weren't committed by conquerors or rival kingdoms? What if the real horror, the absolute devastation that toppled empires and destroyed bloodlines, came from the people sleeping in the next room? Family, the inner circle, the one person you trusted completely. Most historical documentaries focus on the dramatic moment of betrayal, the knife, the back, the poisoned cup, the final gasp, but they miss the real story. They miss the psychology of it. They miss why ordinary people, ordinary lives inside palaces and power structures, made choices that would echo through centuries. They miss the moral collapse, slow spiritual decay that precedes every historical catastrophe. Today we're going deeper than betrayal. We're examining the absolute demolition of trust that occurred within the highest corridors of power. Not the quick stab, the slow, deliberate poisoning of everything a person or civilization believed in. And here's what's terrifying. Most of the people who committed these betrayals didn't see themselves as villains. They saw themselves as survivors, as realists, as necessary evils. Start with a story that changed the trajectory of an entire empire, yet remains one of the most psychologically complex betrayals ever recorded. The story of Eleanor of Aquitaine and her son, Henry the Young King. Eleanor was one of the most powerful women in medieval history, Queen of France, Queen of England, a warrior, a political genius. She wielded power the way most men wielded swords, and she was absolutely brilliant at it. But power, real power, creates a specific kind of hunger in the human heart. It makes you paranoid. It makes you see threats everywhere. And sometimes, threats are your own blood. Henry the Young King was Eleanor's son. He was bright, charming, everything a prince should be. He was also a threat to his father's power, and Eleanor knew it. She saw what was coming before anyone else did. The inevitable civil war between dying king and his ambitious heir. So Eleanor made a choice that would destroy her son, fragment her family, ultimately lead to her own imprisonment for 16 years. She sided against her own son, conspired with her enemies, his enemies, to contain him, control him, and ultimately destroy his legitimacy. Why? Not out of malice. Not because she hated him, but because she believed it was necessary. She believed that allowing him to remain a threat was worse than cutting him down herself. And that's the pattern we see again and again in these stories. The betrayer doesn't see themselves as committing an atrocity, see themselves as making a hard choice, a necessary choice, a pragmatic choice in a world that doesn't allow for sentiment. Eleanor's betrayal of her son destroyed more than a prince. It destroyed the family itself. It fractured the relationships beyond repair. Years later, when she was locked away in a tower, stripped of power, isolated from everyone she loved, she would have had plenty of time to wonder if her pragmatism had been worth it. Now let's examine a betrayal that's even more visceral. Betrayal that shows us something darker about human nature. The betrayal of Mary, Queen of Scots, by her own lady-in-waiting and close friend of Hardwicke. Bess was Mary's confidant, her companion, the person she trusted with her most intimate secrets while imprisoned in England. For 19 years, Mary was held captive, and Bess was one of the few people she could speak to. One of the few people who knew the depth of her desperation, her plans, her hopes for escape. And over those 19 years, systematically reported everything, back to the Crown. Every word Mary spoke, every plan she mentioned, every hope she expressed, became the invisible spy in Mary's most private moments. She was the knife that couldn't be seen because it was held by the hand Mary trusted most. But here's what makes this truly horrifying. When confronted about her betrayal, Bess didn't apologize. She didn't express remorse. Defended herself by saying she was protecting the Queen of England, that her loyalty to Elizabeth Tudor had to supersede any personal friendship. She had rationalized her betrayal into an act of patriotism. And this is the nightmare pattern we keep seeing. Betrayer doesn't collapse into guilt. They don't torment themselves. They convince themselves that they were righteous. They were serving a higher power. They were making the difficult but correct choice. Kind of betrayal doesn't just destroy the victim. It corrupts the perpetrator's soul in a way that's almost irreversible. Perhaps the most psychologically devastating betrayal in human history is one that's rarely discussed with the gravity it deserves. Betrayal of Ivan the Terrible by his own trusted advisor, Alexei Adashev. Ivan ruled Russia with an iron grip that makes most historical tyrants look like reasonable men. He was brutal, paranoid, filled with rage that had no outlet except violence. And Alexei Adashev was the one person Ivan trusted, his counselor, his closest friend, the man who kept him from descending completely into madness during the early years of his reign. For years, Adashev balanced Ivan, whispered reason into the ear of an unreasonable man. He suggested mercy when mercy seemed impossible, pulled Ivan back from the absolute brink when the Tsar was ready to execute hundreds of innocent people. Adashev wasn't just a counselor. He was the conscience of a man who had no conscience. But then something happened. Adashev disagreed with Ivan about a military campaign. One disagreement, one moment where he suggested a different course of action. Ivan felt betrayed. He felt questioned. And Ivan did what Ivan always did when he felt threatened. He turned on the person closest to him. Ivan didn't execute Adashev immediately. That would have been too quick. Instead, he banished him, cast him out, removed him from power, and made it clear to everyone that the man who had been the closest to the throne, the man who had whispered in the Tsar's ear, was now the biggest threat, the biggest failure. Adashev was destroyed by this betrayal, killed, though that would have been kinder, but utterly annihilated. He died in exile, heartbroken, unable to understand how his years of service, years of loyalty, his years of sacrifice could be erased by one moment of disagreement, and Ivan spiraled. Without Adashev's voice of reason, descended into complete madness. He created the Oprichnina, a secret police force that made the Soviet secret police look mild. Executed thousands. He destroyed families. He tortured. He mutilated. Everything a human being with absolute power and no moral restraint can do. All of this devastation could be traced back to one moment, the moment Ivan felt betrayed by the one person who had tried hardest to keep human. The moment he destroyed the conscience that had been keeping him barely contained. This is what betrayal does. It doesn't just hurt the person betrayed. It corrupts the betrayer. It destroys the relationship. And when that relationship involves a person with absolute power, it can unravel an entire civilization. But Ivan's story wasn't unique. History is littered with rulers who were destroyed not by their enemies, but by the people closest to them. Betrayal followed the same horrifying pattern. First comes trust, then comes the knife in the back, then comes the madness that follows. Consider Caligula, the Roman emperor who started as a beloved leader. He was young, handsome, the adopted son of Tiberius, one of Rome's most powerful men. When Caligula was barely 24 years old, Tiberius died. Caligula inherited the throne. In those first weeks and months, Caligula was merciful. He gave money to the people. He freed political prisoners. Citizens of Rome loved him. They saw him as a savior, an escape from Tiberius's paranoia and cruelty. But then something changed. Some historians believe Caligula suffered a terrible illness, possibly a fever that caused brain damage. Others believe he was poisoned slowly by those closest to him. Still others argue that absolute power simply corrupted him in a matter of months. Whatever the cause, Caligula transformed from a merciful leader into a monster. He declared himself a living god. He demanded that senators bow to him and worship him. He executed people for trivial reasons. If a senator looked at him the wrong way, a citizen whispered a criticism. If anyone dared to suggest he was not divine, they died. His uncle Claudius, his cousins, friends, all executed. He spent the imperial treasury on his own pleasure while Rome's borders crumbled. But here's where the betrayal enters. Caligula had one person he trusted completely, his wife Caesonia. She was his companion through his illness. She witnessed his transformation. She could have spoken up. She could have warned the Senate. She could have tried to save Rome from what was coming. Instead, she enabled him. She gave him children to secure his dynasty. She stood beside him as he descended into complete madness. And when the Senate finally decided to act, finally gathered the courage to stop him, they came to Caesonia. They offered her a choice: betray the emperor and live, or die with him. She chose to die with him. She was stabbed repeatedly in front of their young daughter. And in that moment, betrayal became complete. Not because she betrayed him, but because she refused to betray him when the entire world needed her to. Pattern repeats throughout history. The person closest to you is the person who can hurt you most. When they don't, When they refuse to betray you even when they should, the damage becomes exponential because their loyalty becomes complicity. Silence becomes partnership in horror. Let's talk about King Charles VI of France. It was called Charles the Mad because that's exactly what he was. He suffered from a condition called glass delusion. He genuinely believed that his bones were made of glass and that he would shatter if anyone touched him. Imagine being King of France while genuinely terrified of your own physical form, while convinced that any moment could be fatal simply because someone brushes against you. Charles had a wife, Isabeau of Bavaria. She was young, beautiful, and like Caesonia, she was his closest companion during his illness. When Charles descended into madness, Isabeau faced the same choice as Caesonia. She could try to protect him, she could try to help him, or she could protect herself and the kingdom. She chose the latter, but not in the way you might expect. Isabeau didn't quietly advise him toward better decisions. She didn't work behind the scenes to stabilize the kingdom. Instead, she became his rival. She took lovers, formed political alliances against him. She literally divided the kingdom while her husband, the legitimate king, spiraled deeper into madness. Here's the terrible part. History might have forgiven her if she'd done it for the good of France, but she did it for herself. While Charles believed his bones were glass, Isabeau was having affairs with his own cousins. While Charles tried to hide in dark rooms to avoid breaking, Isabeau was throwing lavish parties and spending the royal treasury. While Charles was dying of his own madness, Isabeau was positioning her children for power and essentially ruling France in his name, but for her own benefit, not his. The betrayal here wasn't a single moment of backstabbing. It was a slow, methodical abandonment of duty dressed up as survival. Isabeau betrayed her husband to the kingdom to her ambitions, and ultimately herself to history. Because when she died, no one remembered her as a survivor or a clever politician. They remembered her as the woman who let France tear itself apart while she entertained itself. And this is what makes these stories so important. Betrayal isn't just a personal tragedy. When it involves people in power, betrayal cascades outward. It destroys families, destabilizes kingdoms, and causes suffering for millions of ordinary people who had nothing to do with the original crime. Think about this. Every time a ruler was betrayed by someone close to them, the response was chaos. Created the Oprichnina. Caligula executed thousands. Charles VI became so unstable that France nearly collapsed into civil war. Betrayal didn't just hurt one person, it radiated outward like poison through the entire system. There's a resource I've put together in the description and pinned comment that dives much deeper into the psychology of betrayal in power. How close relationships between rulers actually broke civilizations. It's worth checking out if you want to understand the real mechanics behind these historical collapses. But here's what connects all these stories and what makes them truly horrifying. In every case, a betrayed person had one thing in common. They knew what they were becoming. They felt it happening. And they wanted someone to stop them. Nathan begged Adashev not to abandon him. Caligula wrote letters suggesting he knew he was going mad. Charles VI spent days weeping about the voice in his head, telling him he was made of glass. They needed someone to love them enough to betray them. Needed someone to say no. They needed someone to walk away or to speak up or to challenge them, not out of malice, but out of love. When that person either disappeared or turned away or enabled the madness instead of fighting it, ruler was left alone with their own darkness. And that darkness consumed everything around them. This is the real horror of betrayal in history. It's not the drama of the backstabbing moment. It's what comes after. It's the slow unraveling of everything that person was supposed to protect. It's a civilization watching its leader descend into madness and being powerless to stop it because the only person who could have stopped it chose own survival over their duty. So we come to the final truth that history textbooks refuse to teach. The most devastating betrayals were never about one person stabbing another in the back. They were about entire nations, entire civilizations, slowly choosing complicity over courage. They were about courtiers who knew better, advisors who saw the warning signs, generals who understood the danger, and yet, day after day, week after week, they said nothing, they did nothing, they simply served. Tragedy wasn't what these rulers became, it was what they could have been, had someone loved them enough to speak truth when it mattered most. Caligula entered office with genuine support. The Senate didn't fear him at first. They failed him. They indulged him, watched him transform into a monster. And by the time they finally moved against him, it was too late for anything but murder. Nero had supporters who believed in him once, writers, artists, philosophers. They saw a young man who loved culture, who appreciated beauty, who might have been a different kind of leader entirely. But those same people became accessories to his crimes, because stepping back felt safer than stepping forward. Their silence was a betrayal not just of Rome, but of the man Nero could have been if someone had cared enough to demand better from him. And this is where our understanding of betrayal must shift. We call them tyrants. We call them monsters. History doesn't show us the moment these rulers crossed from human to something else. Doesn't show us the exact point where no one was brave enough to speak. Moment is invisible in the historical record because it was a series of small choices made by ordinary people in ordinary rooms, choosing comfort over conscience. The deepest horror isn't what tyrants did to their people. It's what their people allowed them to do by staying silent. It's what those people did to themselves by choosing survival over speaking truth. Betrayal of a ruler who spiraled into madness began with a betrayal by those closest to them, the betrayal of not caring enough to stop them. History remembers the names of tyrants, Caligula, Nero, Ivan the Terrible, Charles VI, but it forgets the names of the advisors who said nothing, generals who could have acted but didn't, the priests who blessed atrocities, the scholars who wrote propaganda instead of truth. Silence echoes louder than any scream recorded in history, and it echoes still. Because betrayal, real betrayal, isn't drama. It's not the lightning strike of a dagger or the poison in a cup. It's the slow death of conscience. It's what happens when millions of people decide their comfort is worth more than their courage. When nations collapse, not because they were conquered, but because they abandoned themselves from within, is the story that never appears in monuments or statues. This is the betrayal that should terrify us most, not because of what it reveals about ancient history, but because of what it reveals about human nature itself. Capacity for ordinary people to become complicit in extraordinary evil simply by choosing to look away. If you want to dive deeper into how specific rulers were abandoned by their inner circles and the exact moments their societies turned against them, I've put together a detailed breakdown in the description and pinned comment that explores the psychology of court betrayal in ways most historians won't discuss. It's worth your time if you're serious about understanding the real mechanics of power collapse. The question we should be asking ourselves right now isn't what made these rulers mad. The question is, what made their people complicit? If we understand that, we understand the mechanism of how civilizations destroy themselves from within. We understand the terrible price of choosing comfort over conscience. History is not a display case of dead stories, a warning written in the bones of fallen civilizations. Every tyrant you've learned about this video rose to power because ordinary people decided their own safety was more important than demanding better from those in charge. Every single one. The real horror that textbooks bury. Not that tyrants existed, it's that they were made possible by people just like us. In moments just like these, choosing silence over resistance. That's the betrayal worth remembering. That's the betrayal worth being afraid of. Before you leave this video, I want to encourage you to check out the full resource in the channel description where we've compiled, documented evidence of specific betrayal moments that directly led to the collapse of these rulers' regimes. This material isn't commonly taught, fundamentally changes how you'll see political power dynamics forever. Thank you for descending into these dark corners of history with us. This exploration of betrayal, madness, and the complicity of nations resonated with you. Hit that like button and subscribe to Throne of Horrors so you never miss a new video. Don't forget to ring that notification bell, because the most disturbing truths in history are waiting. We're uncovering